Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting of the Traffic Mobility Review Board to order. Before we begin, let me hand it over to Paige Graves, MTA's General Counsel, for some important meeting information.
Chair Weisbrod, Paige is unable to be with us today.
You're not Paige Graves, I can tell.
Not today.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Fryman, MTA B&T General Counsel. In accordance with New York Open Meetings Law, this meeting is open to the public and the media. In addition, this meeting is being live streamed by the MTA and will be available on the MTA website and YouTube channel. Today's meeting does not include a public comment period. I will remind all who are attending today's meeting to please adhere to MTA's Code of Conduct and Decorum. These guidelines can be found on mta.info and are posted outside this meeting room. We will now play the safety announcement.
Your safety is of the foremost importance to the MTA. Therefore, we ask that you listen and adhere to the following instructions. If you witness an emergency, notify emergency personnel in the room and call 911 immediately. Please follow any audible instructions provided through the public address system or visually on screens in the event of an emergency. If an alarm sounds, wait for a public address announcement and follow instructions. If told to go to another floor or to evacuate the building, leave all unessential items behind and use stairwell A just across the main hallway or stairwell B down the hallway past the elevators. If you have a mobility disability or cannot self-evacuate, please proceed to stairwell D or E for assistance by MTA staff or emergency personnel. An automated external defibrillator, AED, for use by trained personnel is in the main hallway just past the elevators. If you need assistance during an evacuation, please tell an MTA staff member or emergency personnel. Thank you and have a safe day.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Carl Weisbrod. I am the chair of the Traffic Mobility Review Board. I am a former chair of the New York City Planning Commission and director of the city's planning department. Let me ask my colleagues and fellow members of this board to introduce themselves one at a time. John?
Good afternoon. My name is John Banks, and I'm a President Emeritus of the Real Estate Board of New York.
And John Durso.
Good afternoon. My name is John Durso. I'm the president of the Long Island Federation of Labor and the president of Local 338, based in Mineola.
And John Samuelson.
John Samuelson, International President of the Transport Workers Union.
And Elizabeth Velez.
Good afternoon. Elizabeth Velez, President of the Velez Organization.
And remotely from beautiful Puerto Rico, Kathy Wild. Where are you, Kathy? There you are.
I'm in Quebradillas. Kathy Wild, President and CEO of the Partnership for New York City.
Thank you. The Traffic Mobility Review Board was established pursuant to the 2019 MTA Reform and Traffic Mobility Act to make recommendations to the Board of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, an affiliate of the MTA, regarding toll amounts as well as potential credits, exemptions, and discounts to implement congestion pricing in New York City in the area south of 60th Street in Manhattan. We, the members of the TMRB, have asked Juliet Michelson to present today's major issues that we'll be addressing. We've asked Juliet to start by presenting answers to some of the questions that were raised at our first meeting in July. And with that, I turn the floor over to you. Let me just say, Juliet's going to go through a variety of different issues. I'd ask my colleagues to hold their questions until she finishes each section and then ask questions on that specific question and wrap it up at the end. So,
thank you, Carl. Thank you, Carl. Thank you to all members of this illustrious board for the time and commitment that you've made to this complicated initiative. So at our last meeting, we spoke about the reasons that New York was moving forward with congestion pricing. We talked about how the Manhattan Central Business District was one of the most congested in the US, with travel speeds of just about 5 miles an hour in Midtown, and how that's bad for air quality, for quality of life, for economic productivity, and so much more. We talked about how the project's in-depth environmental assessment found that charging cars to enter the Manhattan CBD would reduce traffic by 15 to 20%. That is transformative. At that meeting, we also talked about the role that the TMRB plays in this whole thing, your role, your charge being to develop a tolling structure that reduces traffic congestion and generates enough revenue to fund $15 billion in transit improvements. We identified the 7 key recommendation areas that you'll need to provide guidance on, and we talked about some of the key things to keep in mind. I won't go over all of them, but a handful are that your goal is to keep the toll low while still fulfilling the goals of the program, that everything is connected to everything else. Every discount or exemption will raise the toll for everyone else, and that higher tolls lead to more people avoiding the CBD, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes that leads to additional traffic through communities with already large volumes of vehicles and vehicle emissions. At that meeting, you asked a number of questions, several of which MTA and DOT staff were able to answer on the spot, but some of which required them to get back to us. So since that meeting in July, we have been working with MTA and DOT to develop answers to these questions, and that's what we'd like to present to you today as fodder for further discussion. So first, let's talk about crossing credits. You'll recall that nearly a third of all vehicles entering the CBD are coming in on one of 4 tunnels that already charge a toll, roughly $14 toll round trip. Some parties have suggested that those drivers should get a discount, what we call a credit, on the CBD toll for having paid that tunnel toll. At the last meeting, we talked about how those crossing credits would reduce toll shopping, but how they would also increase the base toll rate, which in turn would encourage more vehicles to avoid the CBD and instead drive through other communities. And lastly, how crossing credits would shift the burden of who pays the toll. And Carl asked the MTA to quantify those impacts. So let's start with the financial impact. Let me first say to compare the financial impact of any one possible recommendation that the TMRB board makes, we find it helpful to estimate how it would affect what we call the base auto rate, the toll that regular autos will need to pay. So you'll see this method multiple times over the course of this presentation. And we do that because, and I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat it again, every recommendation about what to charge is connected to every other recommendation. And so because the congestion pricing program has an overall revenue target, it helps to use as a yardstick the base auto rate to estimate and compare different potential tolling recommendations. I think it'll make more sense when we walk through it. So today we'll be comparing 4 different levels of crossing credits for users of the tunnels. The first, of course, is to provide no credit. That's the baseline for the purposes of this analysis. So if those entering the CBD on a tunnel don't get a discount on the CBD toll, for the purposes of this analysis, the base auto rate is constant. If instead users of the 4 tunnels received a discount of $4 on the CBD toll, that would, all other things being equal, increase the base auto rate for everyone entering the CBD by 2 to 250. A credit of $7 for users of the 4 tunnels would increase the CBD rate by $3 to $4 for everybody. And a credit of $14 for users of the 4 tunnels would increase the base auto rate by $8 to $9 for everyone. So in this scenario, everyone driving into the CBD would pay the same amount in tolls in total, no matter how they enter the CBD, but some drivers would be contributing much less than other drivers for the congestion they cause in the central business district. It's also worth mentioning that adding $8 to $9 to the base auto rate will get the CBD toll close to the upper range of what was analyzed in the EA, the infamous $23 toll. And then there's the question of how crossing credits will affect traffic patterns. One major issue, of course, is trucks, and how many of those trips are diverted to avoid the CBD. So let's look at that. A full analysis of traffic impacts will require running a full traffic model. And once we get more direction from the TMRB on each of the 7 key recommendation areas, the MTA team will run a full model, a full traffic model, and give us more specific travel impact estimates. But until then, we can rely on 2 scenarios that were developed for the environmental analysis, for the environmental assessment. Specifically, we can look to scenario A, which was a no credit scenario, and scenario E, which was a high credit scenario, so similar to our 0 and to our $14 credits. And what we see is that a high credit, $14 credit scenario would lead to as many as 3,400 additional trucks going out of their way to avoid the congestion toll. Putting that number in context, that's about 5% of all trucks going into the CBD every day. Crossing credits will also have an impact on who pays the CBD toll. Again, once we have more direction from you, the MTA can run a specific traffic model that will give us more specific numbers tailored to the 7 recommendations that you have for us. But in the meantime, we can again turn to scenarios A and E. In scenarios A, trips and revenue are relatively balanced. So drivers from New York make up about 70% of the trips and would pay about 72% of the revenue. And in scenario E, this is the high credit scenario, trips and revenue are no longer in balance. New Jersey vehicles, for example, would make up about 20% of the traffic, but only contribute 21%, and only contribute about 11% of the revenue. Oops. So in other words, sorry, I'll go back one. With a high crossing credit, everyone pays the same to enter the CBD, but some drivers pay less into the congestion pricing fund. They pay less for the congestion they bring to the CBD. Before we move on to trucks,
Questions about crossing credits from anybody? John Banks.
Thank you. Can you just verify that I understand this correctly? What you said in that if the crossing credit is too much, that it will cause people to make decisions and divert traffic to areas that already have or experience negative consequences from the congestion as it is today, and that in fact could have a negative impact on congestion, obviously air quality, asthma rates, and all those other things. So we have to balance the amount of crossing credits against those other social costs as well. Is that fair?
that is fair. I'll hand it over to Allison in a second, but just to say that in no scenario evaluated in the environmental assessment, did the FHWA find so to speak, too much air quality impacts? So hopefully we don't, we shouldn't end up there.
Right, I guess we don't want to make it worse for those
But we
communities, right?
don't want to make it unnecessarily
Right.
worse for
Okay.
those
Thank you.
communities. Allison, do you want to add anything, or that's good?
So I also have a question. If I understand the a high crossing credit, which would be essentially a full crossing credit, and Juliet, if you could go back to
sorry.
the next slide.
Yep.
This is, would actually, please. Would actually, a large crossing credit would actually change the mix of where people came in from. So a large crossing credit would actually increase the percentage of drivers coming in from New Jersey, decrease the percentage of drivers coming in from New York to some extent. Is that right?
New Jersey drivers would have less of an incentive not to come in because they wouldn't be paying any more or little more than they currently pay compared to New York drivers.
Well, if there was a full crossing credit,
Oh,
they
full,
pay
I'm sorry,
zero,
yes.
right?
I'm sorry, full, yes. They
There'd
pay,
be no congestion charge, essentially, for those coming in on the Lincoln, Holland, Battery Tunnel, or Midtown Tunnel, in effect, right? Okay. Thank you. Any other questions about crossing credits? Okay. Next.
Okay. Moving on to trucks. So at our last meeting, we spoke for some time about trucks because even though they make up only 4% of all the vehicles in the CBD, they do have an outsized impact on congestion. Before we get into it, just to make sure we're on the same page, what we're talking about today is not pickup trucks and commercial vans. Those are, in the eyes of congestion pricing, actually considered autos, Class 1 vehicles, if you want to get technical. What the congestion pricing program counts as trucks are what you see on the right side of this screen, which are small, non-articulated trucks, and large trucks, think, semis. So what to charge trucks and how often is a recommendation for the TMRB to make. To help us think this through, we could turn to how trucks are tolled today. The MTA, on its Hugh Carey and Queens Midtown Tunnel, charges small trucks roughly 2 to 3 times what they charge autos, depending on the number of axles. The Port Authority charges small trucks 3 or 4 times what they charge autos on the Lincoln and Holland Tunnel. For large trucks, the MTA charges 4 to 6 times as much as autos, and the Port Authority 5 to 8 times as much, again, depending on the number of axles. And of course, tolls are charged for every single round trip that trucks make. But those tunnel toll rates are developed, in theory anyway, they're developed to capture the cost of the additional wear and tear that these very heavy vehicles have on the roadway, on the infrastructure in general. And in the case of congestion pricing, what we're really trying to get to, of course, is congestion. So if we want to set tolls through the lens of congestion, maybe a different metrics, a more relevant data point is the amount of space that these trucks occupy on the street. In New York City, the maximum allowed length of a non-articulated small truck is 35 feet. The maximum length of a large truck is 55 feet. That corresponds to roughly 2 times and 3 times the length of a regular vehicle, of a regular auto. So since the TMRB is more concerned with congestion than wear and tear on infrastructure, we're going to use that as a starting point. Our baseline for the purposes of this exercise is that small trucks could be charged at twice the auto rate because they occupy roughly twice the amount of space in the street, and large trucks would be charged 3 times the auto rate. So that's the baseline that we're going to be comparing other options to. If instead the TMRB wanted to charge trucks more like what the Port Authority and the MTA do today on their tunnels, so 3 times the auto rate, let's say, for small trucks and 5 times for large trucks, that would bring in more revenue, meaning that the base auto toll rate could come down, in this case by an estimated 50 cents to $1. And I do want to say one thing, which is that the purpose of these comparisons is not to pit trucks against cars. Again, we're using this base auto rate as a yardstick to compare different tolling options. If, on the other hand, the TMRB was of the mind that a vehicle is a vehicle, and why charge trucks a bigger toll when they don't even have the option to take transit, if the TMRB wanted to charge trucks the same rate as cars, then that lower revenue coming in would increase the base auto rate by 75 cents to $1.25. A second question for the TMRB to consider is whether to charge trucks for every entry into the CBD or whether to limit the number of charges per day. Here, our baseline is to charge with every entry. If the TMRB wanted instead to cap the number of charges to once per day, then that would add about 25 cents to 75 cents to the base auto rates. For reference, about 7 in 10 trucks entering the CBD today make only 1 trip per day. Of those coming 2 or more times, many are construction, repair trucks, grocery food, delivery trucks, messenger services, trucks owned by small businesses. Those are trips that generally would be hard to shift to the overnight, and I should mention that the project received many public comments about the importance of those services to the economy and to cost of living and cost of construction in New York. So those are considerations for you to discuss.
Questions about trucks? John Durso.
What are we doing about the trucks, the tractor trailers, that come into the CBD and spend the day there parked, loading, unloading, and operating as a warehouse, how it affects congestion, air quality, and all of that, when you see them at times on both sides of the road, which causes that additional congestion. So what is the plan to address that and eliminate that scenario, which is making things that much harder to get around?
That is a topic about I know nothing at all, so I will turn it to Patrick.
Do you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Smith. I'm with the City Department of Transportation. Thank you for the question. I think there are a few answers. One is that, it's a great priority of the city to make sure that our curbs are being managed effectively, and so the city is looking into creative solutions to better and more actively manage our curb. It's a topic of great focus for us. Increased enforcement of curb regulations to deal with issues like double parking is of course one of those solutions. Another thing that's worth kind of mentioning here is that the City Department of Transportation has our off-hour deliveries program. It's actually something that the Environmental Assessment committed to expanding. And that creates an opportunity for us to work with shippers and receivers to shift these deliveries away from the most congested times of day. I think congestion pricing presents a great opportunity through a cheaper overnight toll to incentivize more of that behavior and focus on expanding that program.
Thank you.
I actually have a follow-up, Patrick. The higher the toll on trucks, the greater the diversion in one way or another. Do you have any sense to what extent a higher toll on, especially on bigger trucks, would divert to later hours as opposed to divert beyond the CBD?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't give you a number of how that breaks down, but I think as I was just talking about the off-hour delivery program and focusing on working directly, particularly with the receivers, to make sure that either they have a secure location on site where they can get that delivery, or that they have the resources to staff overnight, is a really important part of making sure that it's possible to shift into the overnight period.
Another question for you, Juliet, which is, it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe within our authority to treat the small pickup trucks, vans that you showed as in the auto category as autos, even if they have commercial plates.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct. Does Kathy, or do you have a question? Kathy? All right, moving right along. Okay, the TMRB expressed interest in exploring whether a per-ride surcharge could replace a daily toll for taxis and FHVs. So, big picture first, taxis and for-hire vehicles, needless to say, are a big part of how people get around here in New York. They carry more than 1 million passengers a day and make up around half of all vehicles in the CBD. The EA, we talked about this in the last meeting, the EA required that taxis and FHVs not be charged more than once a day in order to avoid any adverse effect on the EJ subpopulation of drivers in the taxi and FHV industry. That said, the EA also found that tolling scenarios that cap the toll at once a day led to additional mileage by taxis and FHVs, so more traffic from what is already half of all vehicles in the CBD. So for those reasons, and because, as I think Elizabeth pointed out at the last meeting, a daily toll would likely not be paid by the customers whose travel behaviors we are trying to influence. For those reasons, you asked us to consider a per-ride surcharge that would be passed on to the customer. So let's look first at some historic trends. What this chart shows is the number of trips citywide made by what we call app-based FHVs, Ubers and Lyfts. And then lower in yellow, you see taxis, and then black cars and green cabs. This is data for every month since January 2015. And what's obviously immediately apparent is that app-based FHVs have radically transformed the market. Strong growth at Uber and Lyft since 2015 has led to steady long-term decline in the taxi trips, and also in black car liveries, green cabs, although those were always a smaller market segment to begin with. So as the chart also shows, a New York State congestion surcharge went into effect in 2019. That surcharge is in many ways comparable to what you are considering today. It applies to all taxi and FHV trips that begin, end, or take place within a particular zone, although in that case, the zone is Manhattan up to 96th Street. What we're discussing today is a surcharge on trips up to 60th Street. For reference, that state congestion charge is $2.75 for app-based FHVs, green cabs, and black cars, and $2.50 for yellow taxis. The charge is passed on directly to the customer, and the revenue is used to improve transit in New York. Let's zoom into the CBD and to more recent years. So here on this chart, in the dark purple, is the cost per mile of Uber and Lyft trips to, from, and within the CBD since the congestion charge was implemented in 2019. So what you see is that that per mile cost has increased more than 50% in the last 4 years. That's more than twice the rate of inflation, and certainly a lot more than the $2.75 congestion charge. And yet, despite Uber and Lyft raising their prices so significantly, demand has continued, still continues, to grow. On the yellow taxi side, the picture is different. Since the congestion surcharge went into effect, fares per mile for trips in the CBD have kept pace with inflation, thanks to a recent fare hike. And while demand initially increased after the peak of the pandemic, it seems to be stabilizing at around 50% of pre-COVID levels. That is the information we have on this complicated topic. Questions or comments?
Questions? John Banks.
So am I interpreting these two charts correctly in that the FHV community is more inelastic than the taxi community, and therefore the riders of FHVs seem to be more able or less price sensitive than yellow taxis?
Patrick, do you want to take that as a DOT representative?
Sure. So I think what we see here certainly is that since the introduction of the app-based for-hire vehicle services, taxi trips have been declining year over year, and we continue to see that into the pandemic. And then something happened, the pandemic hit, the trips in both sectors went nearly to zero for several months. And whereas with Uber and Lyft, we've gotten back pretty close to where we were pre-pandemic, the demand for taxi trips has not resumed. That industry is struggling a lot more. It's suffering more than the app-based for-hire vehicles.
But during that time, price went up for the FHVs, right? Which means the consumer is willing to accept a higher price for the the app-based FHV versus traditional yellow cabs. Is that accurate?
I think you could look at that data and come to that conclusion. Yeah.
John, maybe Juliet, can you go back to the slide that shows the? Yeah, so I think this is what you're getting at, where you're seeing the increasing costs and the ride share, the rides continue to go up as costs. So I would assume, you could assume that the users of this service are, able to or are willing to pay for that increase.
Correct. Thank you.
I have a question.
Anderson.
So with the increase, the 50% increase in the cost of the FHV.
Put it on your mic.
Oh,
It's on.
Okay.
Yeah. I thought it was on. That increase, that significant increase, that was passed on to the employer as opposed to the employees. Is that my understanding of this?
No, that charge is borne by the riders of the for-hire vehicles.
But the decision of what the per mile cost of a trip on an Uber or a Lyft is made by the company.
Okay. And the taxis, which have not had not had the same increase in costs, and they have yet to get back to pre-pandemic numbers.
Correct.
But you said that they had received a small increase or an increase? I
In
shouldn't.
2022, the taxis rate, per mile rate increased.
All right, I just wanted to make sure I understood it. Thank you.
Just to follow up on John's question, to charge FHVs and taxis and/or taxis, the one day a trip charge to enter the zone, that would be, especially since many of those trips presumably would be without a passenger, that would be something that would be a charge on the driver, not likely on the company. Is that a fair?
That is a fair assumption. It would be hard to pass on to a passenger if there is no passenger in the
Right,
vehicle, and it
and-
would be hard to pass on to the company because any one vehicle typically or often drives for multiple companies. It would be very hard to assign it to any one company. So it would be paid for by the driver, which is
Right.
hence the problem identified by the FHWA in the course of the environmental assessment and the decision to cap that charge to one per day.
Right, whereas what we've seen with the congestion charges, at least with respect to the congestion charges to date, with respect to the FHVs, that is the Uber,
Yeah.
Lyft, the passenger is paying that, and demand has not, with respect to them, gone down, but with respect to taxis, it's a different story. Is that right, Patrick?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Thanks.
It's not a question on my end, but listen, I would object to any charge being throttled with the driver. They're earning a living. The driver should not be paying a charge at all. We should figure out a way to build it into the structure and put our minds together and figure out how the driver does not get shackled with the charge.
I'd like to once again remind all who are attending today's meeting to please adhere to MTA's Code of Conduct and Decorum. Thank you.
So, just to follow up? Yeah. Just
Don
to follow
Durso.
up on, so the taxis are able to raise their prices only through, they have to receive permission, is that correct?
It's
Yes.
set by TLC, yes,
Okay.
City of New York.
Who decides the increases for the FHVs?
Those are the particular companies that run those for-hire vehicles.
So the Lyft, Uber, or the different companies have the ability to raise prices that they want, but somebody who drives a cab could drive a cab for 5 or 6 years and not get an increase, is that correct?
That's correct, and as you saw, there hadn't been an increase for a considerable amount of time until more recently for the yellow
Okay.
cars.
So, not, to no surprise, my colleague, Mr. Samuelson, made a very good point that I would fully endorse.
Any other questions on taxis and FHVs at this time? Okay,
Could
thank you.
Juliet just,
Go ahead,
I
Kathy.
think we went over this last time, but could Juliet just talk about the relative numbers of trips in the CBD and the relative number of vehicles between the taxis and the FHVs?
Yeah,
So, let's see if I remember these off the top of my head. The average, well, taxis are much more dependent on the CBD than FHVs are. FHVs are able to pick up across the city. So taxis make an average of 12 pickups in the CBD every day, and FHVs make an average of 6. That said, there are many, many more, I think about 3 times as many FHVs in the CBD streets every day than there are taxis. Just bigger bigger volume of vehicles.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions at the moment on taxis or FHVs? Okay.
Okay. So in a discussion about low-income drivers, I believe it was John Samuelson and Kathy Wild asked for more information about where low-income drivers were commuting from and whether they were commuting from so-called transit deserts, places without transit access. So big picture, out of the 1.5 million people who work in the CBD, 1.3 million take transit, 143,000 drive. That's whether they're coming from the 5 boroughs or beyond. Of those who drive, about 16,100 live in low-income households. And where are these low-income drivers coming from? Well, the vast majority, 7 in 10, drive to the CBD from homes in New York City. And in all, about 5,200 low-income drivers commute to the CBD from outside the city. But the specific concern at our first meeting was whether these commuters lived in transit deserts, communities without access to transit. So the map here shows where low-income people who drive to the CBD live if they don't have direct access to transit. That is to say, if they don't live within a half mile of a subway, train, or bus stop. 1 dot represents 5 people. Now, there's no question that many drivers who have access to for many drivers who have access to transit, the transit, by comparison, is a poor alternative. It might take a lot longer than driving. Service might be infrequent at the time that they are needing to travel. On the other hand, there are also a lot of people represented by a dot on this map who can't walk to transit, but actually do live a short drive from a commuter rail station and may have better transit access than it appears on this map. So this map is imperfect, but it does answer the specific question that was asked last month about where low-income drivers to the CBD commute from and how many live in places without access to transit. And our analysis shows that that number is right around 1,600 people. Questions or comments?
And this does not show anything in the 5 boroughs?
So, other than Breezy Point, every census block in the 5 boroughs is within a half mile of a bus or subway stop. Again, there are many areas in the city where it will take longer to reach the CBD by transit, but if the definition here, which was asked, was a transit desert, yes, that is correct. Other than Breezy Point, no New Yorker lives in a transit desert, as defined by the environmental assessment.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's really important for this board to confer on the low-income driver factor of the environmental assessment and its impact on congestion pricing. There's a key racial component to poverty, especially in a city such as New York City. According to multiple data points, the greatest affected low-income population are Latino and Black communities. Those are the communities that had the greatest adverse impact by the pandemic. Those are the same communities that are still struggling. Our mass transit system can be our city's greatest equalizer and a conduit for economic opportunity. And while we're moving toward greater accessibility through a strong capital plan, we really should look to alleviate some of the burden of congestion pricing on low-income drivers that need to drive with frequency into the CBD as employees, as small business owners, and the like. And I believe we can do this by strengthening the provisions that are included in the environmental assessment.
John Durso.
So could we get that map back?
Sure.
So if you're looking at that map, if you look all the way to the east, just to start there, these are low-income drivers. So that last dot up on the north shore of Long Island, so those folks that are commuting into the city, if they wanted to not commute all the way in, where would they park their vehicle and get access to reasonably quick access to get into the city? It would seem, because that last dot, that's a 2.5-hour commute. Unless you've done it, okay? Okay, that's a 2.5-hour commute. And if you're already a low-income worker going in there, 2.5 hours to get in, to get back, because you don't have access to good, like a desert, all right? How do you accommodate, or how do you say to someone there, or any of these, whether you're on the South Shore or the North Shore or any, listen, you have to park your car and commute, and they'll say to you, tell me where I can do this, where can I get a bus or a train that's going to get me in, and, so I can get in and get out.
John, do you
So
wanna
I'll
take that?
try to take a stab at it. So what we're looking at is low-income drivers. And that number, if there was a map that was low-income New Yorkers, non-drivers, we would have a lot more red dots, particularly on Long Island and everywhere. And if we're also saying low-income non-drivers who are in a transit desert, there's a lot of them. And those people are using, for instance, the Long Island Railroad, they're using buses to get there. So let's just take this population, which is low-income drivers. There are places where you can drive your car, if that's your choice, to do that differently. So if you're going to avoid a congestion fee and you want to take a car instead to Long Island Railroad, that's certainly something that's possible. That's why we have, for example, I think the dot you used would be the closest Long Island Railroad parking lot would be around Konkoma, which is, I think it's around 50% usage rate right now. Westbury, we just opened a lot, which is below 50% usage rate, so there's availability. Same as Mineola is not as much, obviously, it's very popular. Yeah, so that would be the option. Again, that's for the drivers, but as we've discussed, the bigger number really is that people who don't have the opportunity to drive who are low income. And Newsday just did a report last week, or a couple of weeks ago, on that. And they're taking a bus to a car, to a train, and then a subway. So that they're,
Which is also, you're putting in a day's work just to get to work.
correct. Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And that's an issue.
Yeah.
That's an issue.
Yeah, and so, but that the reality is that number is much higher, people
Okay,
who are using mass
So
transit.
I realize, and you have educated me a couple of times on this, that the monies from this is not going for capital, but the other way around. Operating.
Capital, not operating.
Right. But there has to be some consideration in this whole scheme of things to address that issue. Of people being able to, at different hours of the day or different opportunities, where we've talked about the transit deserts, to be able to get in. If you live on the South Shore of Staten Island, okay, and maybe you're able to get a ferry up on the North Shore, but on the South Shore you have issues. I know, I have staff that live on the South Shore of Staten Island. My ears have been bleeding since I joined this lovely group, okay? But by the same token, there has to be some sort of consideration on how we're going to address it, whether it's through this committee or not through this committee, or the people that are listening to what we're saying. In order to make this thing work, we got to think outside this box.
Carl? Just real quick, Carl, if I might.
John Banks.
John McCarthy, isn't one of the issues for the person on the east end of Long Island not just the availability of a place to park, which you suggest there's capacity in many of the stations, but also the time required to take the public transportation, right? There's a balance between, maybe it's not much of a difference, but the times I used to go out to the East End, you know, you can take the train and it takes you 2 hours to get to somewhere, to get to your car, to get home. And I'd have to balance that. Or maybe I just enjoy the extra 15 minutes in my car because I can listen to the radio station I want. I can be alone or whatever. But there are other things that go into the decision-making of when someone drives, not just parking availability, but the quality of life, right? That I don't know if we can fix, but it's part of the decision-making of the commuter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into the heads of every commuter, but of course, people have different reasons for taking different modes. But what we can do is, you know, offer opportunities to take mass transit. And remember, this whole exercise is about decongesting the streets. So we don't see this, and I don't think Albany and the state at the time when they passed this law in 2019 thought they wanted more cars to come in here because people wanted that extra 15 minutes in their car. You know, mass transit works. Mass transit is, you know, look, I've lived here my whole life. I generally have always taken mass transit. I never drove, and I've always thought it's the best way around. So people coming in from Eastern Long Island, yeah, many of them have always picked mass transit over being stuck in the Long Island Expressway. And the key here is, do we have the transportation being offered? And a lot of the readiness projects that got accomplished before this is now going forward included projects that allowed us to run more service from Long Island. And that service, 40% more service, we're able to run now, including off hours in different directions than the rush hour. That's very important to be able to have in place before this was to start up, and that has happened.
That's the third track.
Third track, the second track, there's a yard we had to build out in Ronkonkoma. So these things, you know, they allow us to run that service, because otherwise you would be talking about a lot of people who wouldn't have the frequency of service going in the other direction, which we have now.
John Durso. Oh, I'm sorry, John Samuelson.
Yeah, so just following up on what John said, and perhaps others as well, if you have a situation where, and actually John McCarthy, you say the whole exercise about decongesting the streets, but by not putting new service out, you created a situation where even bifurcating low-income drivers from non-low-income drivers, just taking low-income drivers for a moment, if you're a low-income driver and you're on the outer fringes of the outer boroughs, just take Staten Island, for instance. I live in Brooklyn. I'd never move to Staten Island, but that's another point. But on the outer fringes of Staten Island, okay, you say everybody's within a half a mile to a bus stop. How do you get to the city if you're not going to drive anymore? The whole point's to get everybody out of their car. How are you going to get to the city? I'm curious. Does anybody have an answer for that?
A free
Tell
ferry.
me. So let's take that as a rhetorical question. No answer required for a moment. Even if there is a way to do it, you're a low-income driver, you're now going to incur childcare costs on folks that can't afford it. You're going to put another perhaps 2 hours on their commute, childcare costs, all the other costs that low-income people can't afford to begin with. And there's really, in areas where there is no viable subway option, anybody, Jan Oliva or whoever wants, can say that they're not transit deserts because they're within a half a mile of a bus stop, and it's simply not true. It depends on what hour of the day. First of all, at night, things become a transit desert where they weren't a transit desert 6 hours before. Express bus service ends in some places in the late afternoon. Not putting service out is really a ridiculous way to embrace an exercise that's about decongesting the streets. It's just silly. It doesn't work. And
So,
I think
can I
Allison
just
wanted,
say,
oh, sorry, Kathy and then Allison.
I think that the tools that we're talking about to address the equity issues are not just exemptions or we will never solve this problem. We'll have a situation where a few drivers are paying extraordinary pricing and everybody else is exempt. And that's just not something that's appropriate. So I think we have to look at different tools, and what John and John have suggested, the different tools are to look at where there are inequities in terms of reasonable, efficient access to jobs. And I think we've got to get over this thinking it's not just jobs in Manhattan, but it's the whole system has to be revisited in light of all the changes in our economy and the decentralization of our economy that have gone on in the last few years. So I just think we shouldn't be thinking about this in the context of exempting certain drivers, but rather providing public transportation, efficient options to all those who are seeking to get to work in an efficient way, wherever they're going.
Anything else on low-income drivers for now? We have a lot more work to do, obviously. So, next,
Okay.
Juliet.
All right. So last month, we also spoke about overnight workers. And just to remind everybody, since the daily toll resets at midnight, the concern about folks who need to commute in before midnight and commute out after is that they will have to pay twice. Now, if they work on consecutive days, they wouldn't have to pay to enter on the second day. Nevertheless, over the course of a 5-day work week, they will have to end up paying 6 times, which is a concern. We all want a fair and equitable outcome. So we set out, or the MTA team and our consultants set out to look for what we could learn about this population, and unfortunately published data on work schedule patterns is just very hard to come by. But MTA was able to stitch together national data about typical work shifts by industry with local data on how many people are employed in those same industries in the Manhattan CBD. And by doing that, they estimate that about 48,000 people are at work at 1 a.m. Of course, that doesn't tell us anything about what time they arrived for work or what time they will have to head home. Again, there's no published data with this information. So the MTA went ahead and conducted their own primary research. They spoke to industry representatives, referred back to public comments they'd received, and we happen to have 2 people on this very board who have experience with many people who work in the overnight. And what we all learned looking at this is that, I don't know, maybe unsurprisingly, there's a great variety of shift schedules between industries, and even within industries, there's no sort of uniform schedule. So with that information, we developed with the MTA a few sample, different schedules for how the toll could be applied to help accommodate overnight workers. So let's walk through these 3 schedules. Midnight is in the middle, 12 p.m. is at the left, and again at the right of each chart. At the top, you see what was committed to in the environmental assessment, a 50% discount on the toll from midnight to 4 a.m. The standard rate would apply for the rest of the day. In alternate Schedule 1, we've extended the overnight period to 5 a.m. and added a reduced rate period on either edge of the overnight, after which the full rate would begin. And lastly, in alternate Schedule 2, we made it a 9-hour overnight period from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. with the standard rate applying to the remainder of the day. So again, we'll turn to our exercise of describing different tolling options in terms of how they affect the base auto rate. Here, the baseline is what's committed to in the EA. Compared to that commitment, moving forward with Schedule 1 would add about 25 to 50 cents to the base auto toll, and Schedule 2 would add 75 cents to $1 to the base auto toll. And just one more thing, 2 caveats to, frankly, all of these estimates for this exercise and the truck tolls and the crossing credit tolls. 2 things. One is the traffic models will also inform this group of, as we talked about, new traffic patterns, but also to make sure that whatever choice meets the program, the goals of the program, so the revenue target and the traffic reduction. And even though we have provided estimates or ranges of estimates for each policy decision, once you combine all of them together, each of those ranges will increase in cost. So, leaving it at that.
Just to clarify this, Juliet, the EA environmental assessment at the moment and assumes that during the 12 a.m. to 4 a.m. period, the toll would be no more than 50% of the daytime toll. And these, I assume, both alternative Schedule 1 and 2 reflect the longer hours, but also at a 50% of the daytime toll.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, well, in alternate Schedule 1, we also have this reduced rate period, which is somewhere in between the 50%
Right.
and the 100%.
But in alternate 2, it would be from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. at 50% of whatever the
Correct.
daytime
Yes.
toll would be,
Yeah.
whatever that is.
Thank you for clarifying. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Questions on this for Juliet? Okay.
The only question I have, and it's a point I raised a couple of times, is that the workers that are going into the city get charged at the lesser rate because of that 24-hour thing. And I just want to make sure that that's on everybody's radar and it doesn't get lost. So in other words, if you come in at 9 o'clock at night, you get hit with a lesser rate, or 10 o'clock at night, and you leave at 7 o'clock in the morning from that shift, that you don't get hit with the 7 o'clock in the morning charge. Or because you left at 7 o'clock in the morning, when you come back to work at 9 o'clock at night, it's a lesser charge, that you don't get stuck with the 7 a.m. charge, because that's within the same 24-hour period. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So within any 24-hour period, it should be the lesser of the 2 slaps that you get. Well, maybe that's the wrong way to say it.
Allison, do you want to?
It's probably the wrong way to say it, but,
Yeah.
and I think we'll need clarification
Yeah,
on it for sure.
that-
Yeah,
Go ahead,
my
Allison.
understanding from last time and this time is that you're talking about, regardless of what time the person comes in, they should be charged the lowest toll. We can certainly model that. The goals of the program are to reduce congestion and to raise sufficient funding to support that $15 billion in revenue. If you do the lowest toll, you would be doing it for everyone who comes in during that period, though the workers are actually a very small group there. And so it's something we would need to model to ensure that it doesn't actually move beyond the boundaries of what was modeled in the EA.
All right,
And it
but
would
the workers
certainly
aren't,
increase-
they cannot possibly be a very small group of those going in at night, and they can't be a small group of those exiting the city in the AM. You know, that's what I'm saying, those exiting the city, they're not, revelers are not exiting the city at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Let me
Juliet, just
suggest,
pop back to the other schedule. Right,
This one?
yeah. And again, so the issue is by 6 in the morning, what we found in the final EA with the work that we did, by 6 in the morning, actually it starts at 5. The congestion starts to go up, right? You've seen those charts. They go up pretty quickly, actually, by 6 o'clock and into the 7 o'clock period. And so it's one of the things the team is aware of, and they'll be working with Juliet on this. But we're also cognizant of the great variety here. And so, as you said, it may not be small, but the group that's going at that particular time is not all of them, right? It's a piece of each of these that's going at those particular times. So that's the thing to just be
It
cognizant
would be simple
of.
if there was a way to differentiate those exiting and those entering.
Can I suggest?
Because anybody exiting is leaving work.
John and Allison, can I suggest, this just highlights the point that I think that Juliet was making throughout, which is that this is like a Rubik's Cube. We can't decide on one element of this until we decide on all elements of this, because it all has to fit together. And I hear what you're saying, John, and it makes total sense. And I hear what Allison is saying, which is that it all has to fit together to produce a result. And all of these levers and all of the various increases or decreases and the ranges that Juliet presented should be really followed by the sentence, all other things being equal. And all other things are not equal because we have a lot of variables to play with. And the goal here for all of us is to end up with a result that meets as many of our goals as we possibly can, including the ones that are statutory, and including the equity goals that you've talked about, and Elizabeth's talked about, and we've all talked about. And that is a goal that really is within our not only our power, but our responsibility to do. So with that, I would ask that this is a lot of information. We have to absorb this. We have a few other issues which we haven't yet talked about, other exemptions that have been requested, buses and the like. And we will be back with one more hearing. Yeah.
So Juliet, you had mentioned earlier about how one thing affects the other and all of that so intertwined. So are you able to run the scenarios on some of these so that we can see, well, if we do these here, this is how it affects it, this is how it affects it. So while we want to accomplish the charge of the committee, at the same time, we all have raised real concerns. So at least we would have a better able to say it's not just this piece, but together.
Yes, we can, and I think that is the natural next step,
Yeah.
is to start combining these things and seeing what kind of base toll we end up at with the choices that this group wants to move forward with. And there's a financial element, and then there's also the traffic flow element, and those are two very different exercises. The financial flow is much easier to model than the traffic flow, as you might imagine. But yes, we have to get to both of them before we can make a decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think, John, that is exactly the next step, that taking all of these variables now that we have a better sense of each of them and how to combine them in a way that, again, achieves our statutory responsibilities, but also our public policy and equity goals. So,
And Juliet, I know you had mentioned the financial and the congestion, but there's also the human toll that we have to consider.
Yeah.
How it affects our citizens, our workforce, and everything else. I think that we have to make sure that is kept, on the forefront as well.
and that is, in fact, our public policy and equity responsibilities. So I thank all the members of the TMRB. Juliet, thank you particularly, and thank you, members of the MTA staff and City DOT. We will be reconvening in the very near future for further discussion. So on behalf of the TMRB and the MTA, I'd like to thank all members of the public for attending today, and if there's no other business, may I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.